I'm grateful that you are all able to participate in this program, this webinar today, and thanks to the Nigerian Institute of Advanced Legal Studies for collaborating with the African Center to make this happen. If you look at the theme of the program, we are trying to develop a framework on how best to understand what is happening with Africa's stolen assets and the procedure for the recovery and return, and what has been achieved within the framework of the UN Convention, the African Union Conventions Against Corruption, the Agenda 2063, as well as the UN SDG 16. And in terms of introduction, it's good that we also understand that we are speaking to asset recovery or recovery of assets as a tool to fight illicit financial flow, corruption, and many of the predicate offenses that are ravaging governance systems in Africa. Although this is relatively new tools that countries in Africa have embedded within their legal framework, but one has to say that the process of developing the institutional and legislative frameworks to support the efficient process of tracing, freezing, seizing, and repatriation of stolen assets back to countries in Africa is still relatively new, and African countries are struggling with that process. The recovery of these stolen assets, especially for countries in the global south and particularly in Africa, presents an opportunity for us to bring kleptocrats and financial institutions linked to these kleptocrats to justice, but also to enable us to raise funds that are urgently required, as Prof said, to meet sustainable development goals. In this presentation, our objectives would be then to explore briefly the current state of stolen asset recovery policies, procedures, and legal regimes in African countries, to advocate for the strengthening of laws, practices for stolen asset recovery and return in Africa, to advocate for the use of recovered funds to meet UN Sustainable Development Goals and the AU Agenda 2063 targets, and to meet the legitimate demands of citizens in Africa, as well as to improve knowledge through academic publications. Now, I have to say that what we are presenting here today is still an ongoing work in terms of the research that we hope to publish with the Nigerian Institute of Advanced Studies. But in this presentation, we have to state clearly from the beginning that it was difficult to find figures and values of and stolen assets that left Africa that we're hoping to return back to Africa. We were not able to find some of this information, and most of these countries are yet to document, if you like, the progress that have made since ratifying UNCAC and the African Union Convention Against Corruption. However, like we said, it should be good that as you participate in this program, you can send us your feedback, and we would appreciate your comments at the end of the presentation as well. Now, in terms of definition of terms, I will not waste time here, but I will just add quickly that in many of the conventions and the national laws that we have seen, asset is used interchangeably with property and is often defined as every kind of asset, whether corporeal or incorporeal, movable or immovable, tangible or intangible, and legal documents or instruments evidencing title to or interest in such assets. It's also important to note that African Union uses the same definition used by the UN Convention, and therefore it would then be expected that countries that are enacting their national laws on asset recovery would use the same framework in terms of those definitions. Next slide. Now, we've also set out different definitions from different organizations, but the most important thing, and we are relying essentially on the AU Convention and the UN Convention definition. Next slide. Now, in terms of the UN Convention, what we have today stating what the process for asset recovery and asset return that is critical to this conversation is set out in Articles 51 to 59 of the UN Convention. when you take a look at the UN Convention, it makes the process of asset recovery and return a fundamental principle of the UN Convention against corruption. And this is because the need for countries in Africa and in the developing, a major conversation, if you like, a debate around the procedure for recovery and return. It was also important for developing countries that this process be understood in a manner that if these assets are leaving African countries, then there is need to have in place within the UN Convention the need for these assets to be returned in order to form a global coalition and international cooperation around asset return. And most importantly, because these countries need these assets to be returned for sustainable development. Within Article, we talk about return of assets as fundamental principle. Of course, there's always a debate about what fundamental principle means and what it does not mean, and whether it is a mandatory requirement of UNCAC. Then Article 52 talks about detection and prevention. There's a requirement for law enforcement institutions, financial institutions, and every platform that can be used to transfer illicit funds are required to be prevented by countries of origin. Then you have the Article 53 on measures for direct recovery of property, and then mechanisms for international cooperation under Article 54. Now, Article 55 sets out the international cooperation required for confiscation, special cooperation, and then 57, these assets are taken away from African countries, that we have institutions, we have the legal frameworks, we have financial intelligence units that can provide information, and then we have the capacity that Prof spoke to about, the legal capacity, the financial tracing capacity, as well as the capability to negotiate bilateral and multilateral agreements for the return of those assets. As we see today, many countries, like I said, are struggling with all of these issues to be able to seek for the return of those assets. Now, in my next slide, I'll speak briefly about the African Union Convention, but we're going to set aside the African Union related issues to our next presentation on African Union. But essentially, we should note that the African Union has also spelled out the need for the prevention and criminalization of corruption, as well as the predicate offenses related to the process of illicit enrichment and illicit financial flow. The convention has also provided for confiscation and seizure of proceeds of and instrumentalities of corruption, and has also provided for international cooperation and mutual legal assistance, particularly within and amongst African countries, something that we find in our research is still very lacking. Cooperation within African countries in ensuring that stolen assets are recovered. Now, within the UN SDG 16, and this is where we begin to talk about what is the UN, what are the contemporary issues that we are seeing. Of course, the UN SDG 16 speaks to the need, particularly 16.4, speaks to the need for countries to significantly reduce illicit financial and arms flow, but in particularly to strengthen the recovery and return of stolen assets and to combat all forms of organized crime. And why this is important for us is that as the UN SDG Summit is meeting, the question is, are African countries meeting these targets? How are we meeting it? And what are the indicators to show that we are meeting these targets? Now, interestingly, the AU agenda has now requires that Africa countries by 2063 should meet the development indicators related to social and economic development, continental and regional integration, democratic governance, peace and security, amongst others. Aspiration 3 in particular, and goals 11 and 12 of the agenda, aims to achieve good governance, respect for human rights, justice and rule of law, as well as strengthen governance, accountability, and transparency as a foundation for a peaceful Africa. Again, the question is, are African countries going to meet these targets? Our argument in saying this is that We can meet it if we can begin to look at what Africa has lost and how Africa can gain back all those resources that it has lost and bring it back to ensure that we can development. The instrument, if I recognize that Africa is still lagging behind in the recovery of stolen assets. That is why the African Union, working together with member states, decided to set out a, if you like, concrete framework to begin to detect and identify illicit the countries in Africa and within Africa. So we recognize as Africans that we can't do this alone. We have to work with other countries to achieve this objective. And that is why issues related to international cooperation and regional cooperation is so integral as contextualizing. One of the things we also did in this research to say, why is this happening? Why are we seeing so much assets going out? Are there so much illicit assets flowing out of Africa? And then we can take, if you like, statistics from Transparency International. Of course, people will debate whether this is the best statistics and indicators available. Then we also looked at the Afrobarometer. We've looked at the Open Society Foundation Barometer that was released recently. Speaks to the fact that there are issues related to corruption and illicit financial flow in Africa. And when we look at it averagely in Africa, there are about, today, 20 countries that are scoring within the rank of 33 averagely. And these countries that we have listed here show that there is a problem, not only of corruption, but also the fact that most of these assets that are leaving are leading to underdevelopment in many of our African countries. Now, we did a small review of what we are seeing in terms of where countries have the loss and where assets have been traced and recovered. In some cases, these are either information that we are obtained online because there are very few countries that are publishing recovered assets and returned assets online. We also looked at the UNODC Working Group on Asset Recovery Group, which is a body under the UN state parties, Conference of State Parties. The reports that when countries allow them to publish, then you can begin to see some of this information. We also looked at the mutual evaluation reports of some of the African countries that are available online. What we can say for sure is that there are limited information online and that are publicly available from African countries regarding, one, recovered assets, two, returned assets, and how these returned assets are being utilized. And so, like I said, this is an ongoing research, and it would be very good if participants in this webinar would also share their information with us. We are providing our information, email addresses online, and you could certainly contact us if you have updates regarding these countries, you can provide that update. But what we are seeing is that in Nigeria in particular, Nigeria is leading the pack of African countries in terms of recovered assets. Then we have Zambia, we have Tanzania, we have Kenya, we have Ghana. We didn't see information on those recovered assets, but we do know that if you look at the other side of this presentation, you will see that we also indicated where there is a law. So if there's a law, there's a likelihood that countries will be able to move forward in terms of the recovery. But then beyond the law is the issue of institutional capacity. Do these countries, are they able to engage internationally? Do they have the capacity to deal with the cooperation frameworks that present challenges when we seek to recover assets from other countries and offshore financial centers? We have Uganda, we have Ethiopia listed here, we have South Africa, we have Burundi, And in terms of this, these are the countries we've been able to identify. And so far, we can say that some of them don't have the laws, but they have been able to recover some assets, as you can see from this slide: Uganda, Ethiopia, South Africa in particular, and Burundi. And so in conclusion, I would say that what we have been trying to do is to identify where the laws are, where the assets are, and what have been recovered, and then what is available for public information. I need to add here that based on the preliminary findings that we have, the challenges for Africa is, one, in having strong legislative framework for recovery of assets; two, in developing the capacities that are required in financial investigation and tracing of looted assets; three is also to work cooperatively with other countries outside of Africa and within Africa to ensure that these assets can be recovered. And then finally is the issue of management of these assets when they are recovered. So, for example, there are debates about whether there is a revolving door and whether assets that are recovered are being properly managed. But these, again, are political dynamics and political economic issues that countries are dealing with. And I believe this is why African Union came up with the common asset recovery position. And I believe that as we continue to engage in this conversation, African Union, within its framework and ongoing work, we work with international organizations such as the UN ODC, the World Bank, as well as the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, to make sure that a proper system is put in place in African countries to continue to ensure that we can recover these assets for sustainable development, but also to meet our SDG targets by 2030, and to also meet up with the AU